What hurts the most about loving an avoidant isn't the silence, it's the confusion. One day they pull you close like you are everything they ever wanted. The next day, they disappear emotionally and leave you questioning your worth. But here's what most people never understand. Avoidants don't run because they feel nothing. They run because they feel too much. And eventually, there comes a moment when the distance stops protecting them and starts destroying them. That's the moment they are, right? Finally forced to face the truth about how deeply they really feel about you. Most people think avoidants walk away because they do not care. That is the biggest misunderstanding of all. The truth is, many avoidants feel emotions so deeply that they become overwhelmed by them. Instead of expressing those feelings openly, they suppress them. They convince themselves they need space, independence, control, and emotional distance in order to feel safe. But no matter how hard someone tries to bury, emotions, the heart keeps records the mind cannot erase. At first, avoidance feels powerful. It feels like protection. They pull away after intimacy because vulnerability scares them. The closer someone gets, the more exposed they feel. Love becomes dangerous because love has the power to disappoint, reject, abandon, or consume them emotionally. So they create distance. They stop texting as much. They become cold after moments of closeness. They distract themselves with work, routines, entertainment, or isolation. From the outside, it looks like they have moved on easily. But internally, something very different is happening. Suppressed emotions do not disappear. They wait. The avoidant may spend weeks or months convincing themselves they made the right decision. They tell themselves they needed freedom. They say the relationship was too intense, too emotional, or too demanding. But eventually silence becomes louder than distraction. The nights become heavier. The emptiness, becomes harder to ignore, and the very distance they once believed would bring peace starts creating pain instead. That is the moment everything begins to shift. Because emotional suppression comes with a cost. You cannot numb one emotion without numbing others too. When avoidants disconnect from vulnerability, they also disconnect from joy, intimacy, warmth, and deep human connection. They may appear calm on the surface, but underneath they often feel emotionally exhausted, disconnected, lonely. The heart was never designed to survive in permanent emotional isolation. And here is what makes this even more painful for them. Memories begin to return stronger than before. The mind starts replaying moments they tried to minimize, your voice, your presence, the way you understood them emotionally, the safety they secretly felt around you even if they never admitted it. Small details begin haunting their silence. Suddenly, they realize not everyone made them feel the way you did. Everyone saw through their walls. Not everyone stayed patient with their emotional confusion. But by the time they begin feeling this deeply, you may already be gone emotionally. That realization creates emotional pressure inside them, because avoidants are often comfortable running from conflict, but they struggle when forced to sit alone with unresolved emotions, and the longer they suppress those emotions, the stronger they become. What was once manageable sadness turns into regret. What was once emotional distance turns into emotional starvation. People often believe avoidants feel relief after leaving meaningful connections. Sometimes they do temporarily, but temporary relief is not healing. Escaping emotions is not the same as resolving them. Eventually, life slows down. Distractions lose their effect. The noise fades. And in that silence, truth becomes impossible to avoid. They begin asking themselves difficult questions. Why can't I stop thinking about this person? Why did I run, from someone who genuinely cared about me? Why does independence suddenly feel empty instead of empowering? Why do I miss the one person who truly understood me? And that is when emotional suppression begins collapsing, because deep inside, most avoidants do want love. They want connection. They want emotional safety. But fear taught them that vulnerability leads to pain. So instead of risking heartbreak, they learned to disconnect before love became too real. Unfortunately, that's survival. Right? Strategy eventually creates the exact pain they were trying to avoid in the first place. Loneliness, regret, emotional emptiness. The human heart cannot thrive without genuine connection. No amount of pretending changes that truth. Eventually, the avoidant realizes that emotional distance protected them from vulnerability, but it also robbed them of intimacy. It kept them safe, but it also kept them alone. And sometimes the hardest truth they are forced to face is this: the person they pushed away was actually the person who made them feel the safest emotionally. That realization hits deeply because avoidants rarely allow themselves to fully depend on anyone emotionally. So when they finally recognize the value of what they lost, the emotions come back with incredible intensity. The grief becomes heavier because it was delayed. Every suppressed feeling returns at once. This is why silence changes avoidance over time. Not because silence magically manipulates them, but because silence removes distractions. It forces them to sit with themselves, and when someone can no longer escape their own emotions, truth rises to the surface. Eventually, distance stops feeling like freedom. It starts feeling like loss. One of the most powerful moments in any relationship with an avoidant happens when you finally stop chasing them. Not when you argue louder, not when you try harder to prove your love, not when you beg for clarity, attention, or reassurance. The real shift begins when you become silent. Because the moment you stop running after them, the avoidant loses the emotional escape route they depended on for control and comfort. Most avoidants are used to people pursuing them emotionally. They are familiar with someone trying to fix the connection, restart communication, or pull them closer after they create distance. Deep down, many avoidants expect that no matter how far they pull away, the other person will still remain emotionally available. That expectation becomes part of the pattern. They retreat and someone else chases. They become cold and someone else fights for warmth. They disappear emotionally and someone else works overtime trying to bring the relationship back to life. But when your energy changes, everything changes. When you stop begging for consistency, when you stop explaining your worth, when you stop trying to force connection, the avoidant is suddenly left alone with something they spend most of their life trying to avoid: themselves. Silence is powerful because it removes distraction. Your constant presence once protected them from fully confronting their own emotions. As long as you kept reaching out, they could stay emotionally detached while still feeling connected in the background. They could maintain distance without truly feeling the consequences of losing you. But your silence changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Now they notice the absence. Now they feel the space. Now they experience what life actually feels like without your emotional energy surrounding them. And at first, they may pretend it does not affect them. Many avoidants respond to silence with even more silence because emotional processing is uncomfortable for them. They distract themselves. They stay busy. They focus on work, routines, social media, entertainment, or temporary connections. They convince themselves they are fine. But eventually, the quiet becomes impossible to outrun. Because human beings are emotionally conditioned by patterns. Your attention became part of their emotional environment. Your messages, your care, your effort, your emotional availability created a sense of security they often took for granted. The moment that consistency disappears, something inside them becomes unsettled. That is when the mind starts replaying everything. Avoidants often suppress emotions during the relationship because vulnerability feels overwhelming in real time. But once the connection becomes uncertain, emotions rise to the surface with surprising intensity. Suddenly, they remember the moments they ignored, the love they minimized, the emotional safety they quietly depended on. Your silence becomes louder than words because it forces reflection, and reflection is uncomfortable for someone who survives through emotional avoidance. For the first time, they cannot blame the relationship dynamics entirely on you. They cannot hide behind temporary distance. They cannot rely on your emotional pursuit to reassure them, right, that you will always stay. Your silence creates emotional accountability. That is why silence often affects avoidance more deeply than confrontation. Arguments allow them to emotionally detach and label the relationship as too much. But calm silence forces them inward. It removes chaos and exposes truth. There are no distractions left, no emotional noise. Only their thoughts, their memories, and the realization that someone who truly cared may finally be letting go. And that, right, realization creates fear, not always fear of being alone physically, but fear of emotional loss. Fear that the one person who understood them may no longer be available. Fear that they pushed away something real because they were too afraid to receive it fully. Fear that they mistook emotional safety for emotional pressure and lost something valuable because they ran from intimacy instead of learning how to handle it. This is the part most people misunderstand about avoidance. They are not, right, emotionless. In fact, many feel emotions deeply beneath the surface, but instead of expressing emotions directly, they suppress, intellectualize, or escape from them. Silence interrupts those escape mechanisms. It forces emotional truth into the open. And during that process, many avoidants begin seeing you differently. When you were constantly available, they may have unconsciously assumed your love would always remain. But when you become emotionally grounded, self-respecting, and no longer, right, desperate for their validation, your value becomes clearer. Your absence reveals the emotional impact your presence had all along. That does not mean silence is a manipulation tactic. Real silence is not about punishing someone. It is about reclaiming your peace. It is about no longer abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable emotionally. And ironically, that self-respect is often what forces avoidance to finally confront their true feelings. Because people rarely recognize, right, the full value of emotional safety until they experience life without it. Eventually, the avoidant reaches a crossroads. They either continue running from vulnerability forever, or they begin acknowledging the emotions they spent so long suppressing. Some continue escaping, but others begin awakening emotionally for the first time in years, and it often begins with the silence they never expected from you. Many avoidants do not fully understand the value of a connection while they are inside it, right? Not because the love is meaningless to them, but because emotional safety can feel unfamiliar, overwhelming, and even frightening. When someone consistently shows up with patience, loyalty, affection, and understanding, they demonstrate a strong and healthy relationship. The avoidant mind often interprets that closeness as pressure instead of security. So rather than relaxing into the relationship, they instinctively create distance to regain emotional control. At first, they believe distance will help them feel free again. They convince, right, themselves they need less attachment, less vulnerability, less emotional dependence. And for a short period of time, that emotional withdrawal may feel relieving. There is no pressure to communicate deeply, no need to confront vulnerable emotions, no fear of losing themselves inside intimacy. But over time, something unexpected happens. The freedom they thought they wanted begins to feel empty, because the human heart naturally notices what is missing once it is gone. When your emotional energy, right, starts disappearing from their life, the avoidant experiences something they secretly fear more than intimacy itself: emotional loss, not imagined loss, real loss. The realization that the connection may not be waiting for them forever. The realization that your patience has limits. The realization that someone who once brought warmth, support, consistency, and emotional understanding is slowly becoming unavailable. And that is when their emotional defenses begin cracking. Avoidants often take, right, emotional safety for granted because deep down they assume people will eventually leave anyway. This belief usually comes from old emotional wounds, childhood conditioning, past betrayals, or painful experiences that taught them vulnerability leads to disappointment. So instead of fully attaching, they learn to stay emotionally guarded. They keep one foot out the door psychologically, believing distance protects them from pain. But distance creates another kind of pain they never prepare for, right? The pain of realizing too late what someone truly meant to them. When your energy changes, the avoidant begins feeling the emotional contrast between life with you and life without you. They notice the absence of your care during difficult moments. They notice the silence where your reassurance once existed. They notice how rare, genuine emotional understanding actually is in this world. And suddenly, memories they once minimized start carrying emotional weight. They remember the conversations, right, where you truly listened, the moments you stayed patient when they were emotionally confused, the way you accepted parts of them they struggled to accept themselves. They begin recognizing that emotional safety is not common. Real connection is not easy to replace. Someone who genuinely understands their inner world is rare. This realization becomes even stronger when they try to distract themselves with surface-level connections. Many avoidants attempt to escape emotional discomfort by staying, right, busy or seeking temporary attention elsewhere. But eventually, they discover something frustrating. Shallow connections cannot recreate emotional depth. You can replace attention. You cannot easily replace emotional safety. That is why many avoidants begin missing someone intensely long after the relationship changes or ends. Once emotional distance removes the pressure they feared, clarity often appears. Without constant vulnerability triggering their defenses, they can finally see the right relationship more honestly. And what they often discover is that the person they ran from was not actually the threat. The real threat was emotional exposure, the fear of needing someone, the fear of becoming vulnerable enough to lose someone important. So when they sense your emotional energy pulling away permanently, panic can quietly begin rising beneath the surface. Not always dramatic panic. Avoidants rarely express emotions in obvious ways immediately. Sometimes it appears as increased, right, curiosity about you. Sometimes they begin checking your social media more often. Sometimes they suddenly reach out after long silence. Sometimes they replay old conversations repeatedly in their mind. Because losing emotional safety activates something deep inside them. It forces them to confront the reality that independence alone does not fulfill the human need for connection. Many avoidants build their identity around self-sufficiency. They pride themselves on needing nobody emotionally. But, right, genuine love challenges that identity. Real emotional connection exposes the truth that even the strongest people still crave understanding, intimacy, and emotional closeness. And when they realize they may have lost that connection because of fear, regret starts growing. This is why avoidants sometimes seem emotionally delayed. While others process emotions during the relationship, avoidants often process emotions after distance occurs. Their defenses suppress feelings in real time. Right? Separation removes those defenses slowly. Once the emotional noise fades, deeper truth begins surfacing. They start recognizing your value not because you begged them to see it, but because your absence made it undeniable. The warmth you brought into their life becomes clearer in the coldness of distance. The emotional stability you offered becomes clearer in loneliness. The love they once questioned becomes clearer when they cannot find it elsewhere. And perhaps the hardest realization of all, right, is understanding that someone who truly loved them existed at a time when they were too emotionally afraid to receive it fully. That realization changes people because eventually the avoidant understands something powerful. Emotional safety was never the thing trapping them. It was the thing protecting them. And the moment they truly feel its absence, they begin realizing how deeply they cared all along. One of the hardest truths an avoidant eventually faces is that not every connection can be, right, replaced. In the beginning, they often convince themselves that moving on will be easy. They tell themselves there are plenty of people in the world, plenty of distractions. plenty of opportunities to start over without dealing with emotional vulnerability. And because avoidants are skilled at emotional detachment, they may genuinely believe they can simply disconnect, move forward, and avoid the deeper feelings attached to the relationship. So they throw themselves into distractions. Some bury themselves in work. Others focus obsessively on routines, goals, hobbies, entertainment, social media, or temporary relationships. They keep their mind occupied because staying busy feels safer than sitting alone with unresolved emotions. Productivity becomes emotional escape. Independence becomes emotional armor. Surface-level interactions become a way to avoid deeper attachment. And for a while, it works. The distractions create temporary relief. The silence becomes manageable. The emotions, stay hidden beneath movement, noise, and control. But eventually something begins happening beneath the surface that they cannot fully explain. Despite all the distractions, despite all the attempts to move on, something still feels missing. Because shallow connections can imitate attention, but they cannot replace emotional depth. This is where avoidants often experience an internal conflict they never expected. They may meet new people, have conversations, even experience attraction elsewhere, but the emotional resonance is different. The connection lacks familiarity. It lacks safety. It lacks the quiet, emotional understanding they once shared with you. And suddenly they begin comparing without meaning to. Not comparing appearances, not comparing lifestyles, comparing emotional impact, how safe they felt around you, how understood they felt with you, how naturally connected the bond felt before fear complicated everything. This realization becomes frustrating for avoidants because they usually rely on emotional distance to maintain control, but emotional memories do not disappear simply because someone chooses avoidance. In fact, emotional suppression often strengthens attachment over time because unresolved emotions continue living beneath the surface. That is why many avoidants become haunted by emotional contrast. The more shallow interactions they experience, the more obvious genuine connection becomes in hindsight. They begin noticing how rare it is to feel emotionally seen by someone, how uncommon it is to feel accepted without pretending, how difficult it is to find someone patient enough to understand their emotional walls without trying to destroy them. And that realization slowly changes the story they once told themselves. At first, they may have framed the relationship as too intense or too emotionally demanding, but with time and distance, clarity begins replacing emotional defensiveness. They start recognizing that the intensity they feared was actually intimacy. The emotional closeness they resisted was actually connection. And the safety they pulled away from was something many people spend their entire lives searching for. The human heart always recognizes depth eventually. Even avoidance cannot permanently outrun genuine emotional connection, because real connection leaves emotional fingerprints behind. It changes the way someone experiences closeness, trust, and vulnerability. Once someone has felt deeply understood, ordinary interactions often begin feeling emotionally empty by comparison. This is why avoidants sometimes appear emotionally conflicted long after separation. Part of them still tries to maintain independence and emotional distance, but another part quietly misses what they lost. Not just the person themselves, but the feeling the connection created. The feeling of being known. The feeling of emotional safety. The feeling of being accepted beneath the walls. And the more they search for that, feeling elsewhere without finding it, the more your value becomes undeniable in their mind. What makes this especially painful is that avoidants often realize these truths too late. While the relationship existed, fear distorted their perception. Vulnerability triggered anxiety instead of gratitude. Emotional closeness felt dangerous instead of healing. So they focus more on protecting themselves than nurturing the connection. But distance changes perspective. Distance removes emotional Pressure and reveals emotional reality. Without daily interaction clouding their emotions, they begin seeing the relationship more clearly. They remember your consistency during moments when they withdrew emotionally. They remember your patience when they struggled to communicate. They remember how deeply you cared even when they made connection difficult. And eventually they reach a painful understanding. Not every connection is replaceable because not every connection is real. Anyone can, provide temporary attention. Anyone can create excitement for a short period of time. But genuine emotional intimacy, the kind that makes someone feel safe, understood, and emotionally accepted, is rare. That rarity becomes impossible for them to ignore over time. Especially when loneliness begins replacing distraction, especially when independence starts feeling emotionally cold instead of empowering, especially when they realize that despite all their efforts to avoid vulnerability, the person they truly connected with still lives in their thoughts. And this is where emotional awakening often begins for avoidance, not through pressure, not through manipulation, but through contrast. Through experiencing the difference between surface-level connection and genuine emotional depth, because eventually they understand something profound. The relationship they ran from was not suffocating them. It was nourishing parts of them they were too afraid to acknowledge. And once they realize, that no distraction, no temporary connection, and no emotional escape truly replaces what they felt with you, their suppressed feelings begin rising to the surface with undeniable force. For a long time, avoidants believe running is the answer. Running from uncomfortable conversations. Running from emotional vulnerability. Running from attachment, dependence, conflict, and intimacy. The moment emotions become too intense, their instinct tells them to create distance, to shut down, to disappear. Emotionally before they feel trapped, overwhelmed, or exposed. And because this strategy may have protected them earlier in life, they continue repeating it again and again without realizing the emotional damage it slowly creates inside them. At first, emotional escape feels effective. The moment they pull away, the pressure decreases temporarily. Silence gives them relief. Independence gives them a sense of control. They convince themselves that distance equals peace. And because avoidants are, often highly self-reliant, they become experts at surviving emotionally without fully opening their heart to anyone. But surviving and healing are not the same thing. Eventually, a person becomes exhausted from constantly running from themselves. That exhaustion is where emotional growth begins. Most avoidants spend years believing the problem is always outside of them. The relationship was too emotional. The connection moved too fast. The other person expected too much. Vulnerability felt, overwhelming. But after enough repeated cycles, something starts becoming impossible to ignore. The same patterns keep repeating no matter who enters their life. Different people, same emotional distancing. Different relationships, same fear of closeness. Different endings, same emptiness afterward. That repetition creates emotional burnout because deep down, avoidants are not emotionless people. Many of them desperately want love, stability, intimacy, and understanding. They want connection, just like everyone else. The difference is that connection activates fear inside them at the same time. Fear of losing themselves, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of depending on someone emotionally, fear of being fully seen, so they continue escaping the very thing they secretly crave most. But eventually the running stops working the way it used to. Distractions lose their power. Isolation no longer feels peaceful. Emotional detachment begins creating loneliness instead of relief. And this is the turning point many avoidants never expect, the moment they realize that emotional avoidance is not protecting them anymore. It is hurting them. That realization can feel incredibly heavy because it forces them to confront years of suppressed emotions all at once. Suddenly they recognize how many meaningful connections were damaged because of fear, how many moments of vulnerability they avoided, how many times did they push away people who genuinely cared, how often did they confuse, right, emotional safety with emotional danger. And perhaps most painfully, they begin realizing that the common denominator in all those broken connections was not bad luck. It was unresolved, emotional fear. This level of self-awareness is uncomfortable, but it is also transformational because growth rarely begins when someone feels comfortable. Growth begins when old coping mechanisms stop providing relief, when emotional escape becomes more painful than emotional honesty. That is why burnout can become the beginning of healing for avoidance. For the first time, they stop asking, how do I escape these feelings? And start asking, why am I so afraid of feeling them in the first place? That question changes everything. Because underneath avoidance is usually an old wound, a belief formed long before the current relationship ever existed. Many avoidants learned early in life that vulnerability was unsafe. Maybe emotions were dismissed. Maybe affection was inconsistent. Maybe. Right? Trust was broken repeatedly. So they adapted by becoming emotionally self-protective. The walls were never built because they wanted to hurt people. The walls were built because they once believed emotional distance was necessary for survival. But adulthood eventually reveals a painful truth. The same walls that protect someone from pain also block them from love. And once avoidants fully understand this, many begin experiencing a deep internal conflict. Part of them still wants safety through distance, but another part is exhausted from loneliness, emotional suppression, and missed connection. The heart starts demanding something the old coping mechanisms cannot provide anymore. Real intimacy. Real honesty, real emotional closeness. This is often the phase where avoidance begins slowly changing. Not overnight, not perfectly, but consciously. They start recognizing their emotional triggers instead of immediately running from them. They begin understanding that vulnerability is not weakness. They start realizing that healthy love does not erase independence, it strengthens emotional security. And perhaps for the first time in their life, they begin staying present during uncomfortable emotions instead of escaping them. That is a massive transformation for someone who spent years surviving through emotional avoidance. Because true emotional growth is not about becoming fearless. It is about choosing honesty even while fear still exists. The avoidant eventually reaches a point where running no longer feels empowering. It feels empty, predictable, lonely. They realize they can either spend their life avoiding vulnerability or finally learn how to experience connection without constantly sabotaging it. And the moment they choose emotional honesty over emotional escape, something powerful happens inside them. They stop viewing love as a threat and start seeing it as the very thing they were searching for all along. The greatest transformation an avoidant can avoid. Experience happens when fear finally loses control over their decisions. For most of their life, fear has been quietly guiding everything. Fear tells them not to get too attached. Fear tells them to hide emotions before someone uses them against them. Fear tells them to create distance whenever intimacy becomes too real. And because these patterns often become deeply wired into their emotional system, avoidants can spend years believing they are simply protecting their peace when, in reality, they are protecting themselves from vulnerability. But eventually there comes a moment where the emotional cost of fear becomes impossible to ignore. Because fear may protect someone from heartbreak temporarily, but it also blocks them from love, connection, trust, and emotional fulfillment. The avoidant slowly begins realizing that every time they ran from vulnerability, they were not only escaping potential pain, they were also abandoning the possibility of genuine intimacy. That realization, changes everything inside them. For perhaps the first time, they stop focusing only on what could go wrong in love and begin noticing what fear has already taken from them. Lost connections, emotional loneliness, regret, missed opportunities to be truly understood by another human being. They begin seeing how many meaningful moments were sabotaged because fear convinced them emotional distance was safer than emotional honesty. And once that awareness begins, their true feelings can no longer, stay buried forever. Because real emotions do not disappear simply because someone avoids expressing them. They remain beneath the surface, waiting for the moment a person becomes emotionally honest enough to face them. The avoidant may have spent months or even years suppressing attachment, minimizing love, or pretending they did not care as deeply as they actually did. But eventually, the emotional walls start cracking under the weight of truth. Truth is difficult to silence forever, especially when someone genuinely mattered. At this stage, the avoidant often begins experiencing emotions with unusual intensity. Memories become emotional instead of distant. The connection they once analyzed logically suddenly becomes deeply personal. They begin feeling the absence of your presence in quiet moments. Songs remind them of you. Familiar places trigger emotions. Small memories return unexpectedly and stay longer than before. Because once fear stops dominating the heart completely, suppressed love rises naturally, and this can feel overwhelming for avoidance because emotional honesty is unfamiliar territory. Many of them spent years disconnecting from feelings the moment vulnerability appeared, but now the emotions they escaped begin demanding attention. The love they once downplayed becomes undeniable. The attachment they tried to suppress becomes impossible to ignore. For the first time, they stop asking themselves how to escape connection and start asking themselves how. They truly feel. That question alone represents enormous emotional growth because emotionally mature love cannot exist without honesty. And honesty requires vulnerability. The avoidant eventually realizes that no meaningful relationship can survive if fear controls every emotional decision. Love requires openness, communication, trust, emotional presence. None of those things can fully exist while someone is constantly preparing to run away emotionally. So the internal battle begins shifting. Instead of fighting closeness, they begin fighting the fear inside themselves. Instead of suppressing emotions, they begin acknowledging them. Instead of pretending not to care, they begin recognizing how deeply they actually feel. And while this transformation is rarely fast or perfect, it changes the avoidant from the inside out. Because once someone experiences the relief of emotional honesty, emotional avoidance begins losing its grip. They start understanding that vulnerability is not the same thing as weakness. In fact, vulnerability becomes the very thing that creates real connection, real intimacy, real trust. The avoidant begins realizing that love was never the enemy. Fear was. Fear convinced them that attachment meant losing control. Fear convinced them that depending on someone emotionally was dangerous. Fear convinced them that emotional distance would keep them safe. But in the end, fear created the loneliness they were trying to avoid all along. That is why true, feelings often emerge most strongly when an avoidant finally stops resisting them. Once they stop constantly analyzing, suppressing, escaping, or denying their emotions, clarity appears naturally. They begin recognizing who genuinely mattered to them emotionally. They begin understanding which connection felt real beyond surface attraction or temporary excitement. And often they realize that the person they were afraid of loving deeply was actually the person who made them feel emotionally safest. That realization can hit with incredible emotional force because it exposes how much fear distorted their perception of love. What once felt overwhelming now feels valuable. What once triggered emotional withdrawal now feels meaningful. What once scared them now becomes the very thing they miss most. And this is where emotional awakening truly happens. Not when the avoidant becomes perfect, Not when fear disappears completely, but when they finally choose truth over self-protection.
When?
Right? They stop running long enough to admit what their heart has known for a long time, that they cared deeply, that the connection was real, and that love becomes powerful the moment fear no longer controls the story.